In this tutorial, I'll cover a quick overview of how to bring your character into the Unity scene, a quick demo of what he looks like. So he should be able to idle in his idle position and then walk around when you're ready for him to walk around. He should be able to do some kind of action, whether it's an attack or picking up an item. He should be able to jump, so he has the ability to jump, and that should be the 4 different actions we're going to add to our character. So, a quick run through of how all that works. The first thing you want to do when you export your character is make sure that you've selected everything. The mesh is what you need. You don't need to select the joints. Just select the mesh, go to File, Export Selection, and make sure you set your animation to bake, and make sure this is an FBX. Once it's FBX, go to Bake Animation. Pick how long it is. In this case, my last frame was on frame 22, so frame 22. And then I would export this one. This would be the jumping sequence. I already have them already exported, but then you go through export all 4 of them, and then you just drag and drop those exported files into Unity. So you have your your attack, idle, jump, and walk. Once you have all 4 of those, you take one of these guys, whichever one you want, and you say you drop them in here, and this could be your starting character. Once you have a starting character, you can start adding all your components onto your main guy. If I were to press play at this point, nothing's going to happen with this guy because he doesn't have any animation on him. He won't move. There's no code on him. So you could take any one of these 4 as your starting point. Once you have it, you go to Add Component, and the components you'll want to add are a rigid body. So on this guy, you would go to Add Component, Physics, Rigid Body. This will give him some gravity so he can fall through. So if you press play now, he's probably going to fall to the ground because he has no collision on him. So now that we have a rigid body, we're also going to need a character controller. And the Capsule Collider you don't need. This is only for if you have some kind of cloth blowing in the wind so it collides with the character. But if you don't have any cloth with physics and all that, then you don't need the Capsule Collider, just the character controller. These numbers right here, the center, radius, and height, that's all based on how big your character is. You would scale that to make sure it fits the size of your character. So if I change any of these numbers, you can see that it moves. There's 2 green ones because the other one's the capsule. Radius and height affect that also. Over here we have our Playmakers, and that's the 3 Playmakers. So in order to create the Playmaker, we'll start with the 1. So you go to Add Component, just like you would go over here. Add Component. At the bottom you have Playmaker. If you don't have Playmaker installed, it should already be on the school's computer, but you'd have to go to the website and purchase a copy of Playmaker. But assuming you're using the school's computer, it's already installed. So we're going to do Playmaker Fsm. When you do that, you go to the Edit button over here, and it pulls up a brand new Playmaker script. The script's already been applied to this character, so you can see we have I named it, the Fsm is the Walking Idle Fsm. Over here we have the state, which is the walking idle state. And these are all the variables or the actions you want to add to your character. We have get velocity. You want to store that as a vector y and do that every frame. And to add these actions, you go down here to where it says Action Browser. Let's slide that up a little higher. So you click on Action Browser. You find what you're looking for. So if I'm looking for get velocity, I can just type in velocity. And it's already under my recent ones. I've already used it before, but otherwise it'd be under physics. So get velocity, you click it and you drag it in here, and you'll get one. I'll drag another one in here. You can see it's going to pop in right there. So I don't need that one anymore, so let's remove. So you want to make sure all these are stacked in the exact order because your code's going to perform from top to bottom, so you have to have these organized in an order. So get the velocity. Then we're going to get the axis vector. So we're going to store it, which is basically his walking left and right. So it's going to store the axis as horizontal and vertical, and we're going to map it to the plane XZ. So we can see here X is red, blue is Z, so those are his 2 horizontal and vertical directions. So vertical doesn't mean height in this case, that would be the green Y. We're going to make this relative to the camera, so if it's an over the shoulder behind the character, you would make it relative to what the camera sees, but since right now it's kind of him just walking around the world, I don't need to make it relative to the camera. We're going to store this as a movement vector. If you don't have movement, you have to go over here to create variables. Under variables, you create a movement one. So you click down here where it says, you type in what you want, variable name, movement, or whatever you want to call it, and click it from float to any one of these things. So this one's a vector 3, so you click on vector 3. Over here I have a speed variable, and that one's a float, and then a vector y, that one's a float. Once you've created a variable and you've added it, click on this gray empty area, and that'll give you the option to make another new variable. Otherwise it kind of leaves the previous one sitting there, so click here and you'll have that open. Over here, back down to state. So that creates the movement. We'll store that one. And speed, store that one. If these don't click into place, it's probably because you have the wrong vector or float attached to them. Once you have those attached, we'll add the action vector 3 add XYZ. We're going to store the vector 3 as a movement, and we're going to store the y as a vector y. And we'll do that every frame so it does it constantly. The reason we're storing y separately is because it's going to erase it when we get to the controller move, so we'll have to recall it again later. So we have the controller move. We'll add this one on here. We don't want to use simple controller move because that'll change some settings we don't want, so we're just going to use regular controller move. We're going to move the vector based on the movement that we've stored up here, and we're going to do it every or per second. We're going to use we're adding vector y. That's what I forgot about that. So we're storing it and we're adding it because it's erased it somewhere up here because it only did the x and z, so that's why we're recalling it there for the y. Alright, so smooth look at direction. This will turn the character to the direction you're facing. This change in this number will affect how fast he turns. Target direction is based on his movement, so once we've stored that, it'll know which way to turn him. Actually, speed might also be the how fast he's spinning them. And then once all those are set, the last one is set Animator Float. This will change our animation controller so it knows when to play. This is going to be the speed parameter. This will be the speed value, and we want to update that every frame. The speed parameter, I used an uppercase S. However you spell this parameter, it needs to be spelled exactly the same way you have them over here in your parameters list in your Animator tab. If you don't have this tab, it's under Windows, not Animation, Animator. So the Animator tab will pull up this whole window right here. And so over here you go to Parameters, you click this little plus sign, and you'll be able to add different parameters. The speed one is going to be a float. You can see there's zeros right there, so it's a float. The sword swing is going to be a trigger. The jump will be a trigger, and the landed will also be a bool. So bool means true or false. If he's landed or not landed. Trigger means when you press a button, this will occur. And float is just based on the variables that are occurring. So let's click back on this guy. Wrong guy. That guy. And that should cover it for the movement. Once that's all been typed in here, he should be able to move left and right. There won't be any jump or attack yet, but he should have movement abilities. Once that's complete, and you can test out the play button, make sure everything works, we want to then add in, actually adding in one of these things will also create a character controller, so that should be everything. Now we can keep adding components down here and adding in more Playmaker stuff, or you can just go over here to where it says walking idle and add an FSM as well. Either option will create another one, or you can switch between the ones you've already made. So I'm going to switch to the attacking one. So this is just like going to here and pressing edit, it'll pull up the same window. Alright, so this is the attacking. We're going to go with get key down as your first action. And I picked the return key, the enter key, which will be the button that triggers his attack. The walking by default is your ASWD keys, or the up, down, left, right keys. Those are programmed by default into Unity. So now once I have the return pressed, enter key, I'm going to send it to the attack button. The attack button is a transition, transition which will send me to the next state. So if I right click, I can go add transition. Finish is default, it should be there usually all the time. Attack button is one I specifically named. Those are under events. So if I do create event down here, type in whatever you want and press enter, add, whatever, it'll add one. So I just called the transition event attack button. So when I pressed, when I go from here, I can then drag the arrow to where it's going to go, to attack, and that'll go to the next state. On this state, I'm going to have pull in the actions set Animator Trigger, and this is where this grabbing the parameter again. So whatever you call it here, letter for letter specific, uppercase, lowercase, is what you want to call it here. If it's not a sword swing, let's say it's punch, you can just call it punch, whatever you want to call it. Remember, it's case sensitive, so spell it the same way. And then wait right here. This is for how long this game's going to wait before reverting back to allow you to press the attack button again. So if you don't have to wait, you could spam the attack button and you'll constantly keep attacking, but you may not even finish the first swing because it's going to restart your animation. So you might want to have some kind of degree of wait time here. So this means 0.5, it'll take half second for him to finish his sword swing. So after half second, it'll allow you to press the sword swing button again. If I had this at 0.1, he'll just keep starting an attack, but he'll never finish it if I keep pressing the button too fast. So depending on how fast your character is like punching, if he can punch within 1/10 of a second, then you might want to put 0.1. If he's doing some kind of super move where it takes him 2 seconds to actually finish it, then you might want to have a wait of 2 seconds. So that's up to you. Once you have finished on there, it'll go to the finish transition and boom, over to idle. And that should more or less give you an attack, relatively easy. None of the animations will work yet because I haven't covered how to apply them, but he should at least move on the ground and he should at least perform an attack whether you see it or not. So the last thing I'll cover is the jumping. Jumping is a little more tedious, I guess, because there's a couple more states in there. Once this is done, I'll then cover all the animations to make a move, so don't worry about the animations just yet. Alright, so under the idle state and create new states, you just simply go to right click add state if you don't already have those. So idle state, I picked the space bar as the jump key. You can pick whatever you want. We're going to do finished event, and all these are finished, so I didn't have to make any new events for this one. So we're going to go to finished, and I could have done that for, I guess, the attack also, just use finished. So we're going to go finished over to the bend state. This is where he's bending down, so if you have a more accurate animation, instead of him just popping off the ground, this way he's going to like kind of duck down before he lifts off. So once you press the spacebar to start the jump, he's going to bend down, and this will start playing your animation. Once you have depending on how long he's going to duck, if he's not going to duck at all, then you wouldn't even need this state right here. But if he's ducking for a little bit, you have, let's say, a 0.2, so it's like 0.2 of a second. It's going to wait for him to play the animation. The set animator trigger will start the trigger right here, which is the jump trigger, and that'll start the jump sequence of the animation, and then wait till he finishes before moving over here, and then we're going to say lift off the ground. So he's not going to lift off the ground until he finishes ducking down, then he's going to lift off. Set velocity, Y will take him and give him a 5 velocity upwards. So it changes number will make him jump higher or lower depending on what number you pick. So depending on the size of your character, the size of your world, you may need more of a jump velocity, you might need less. And you don't want to do it every frame, just a one-time thing when you press the button. Alright, so set animated bool. This is for the landed parameter. So landed over here is now being set to false. It's false because there's no check mark. If the check mark, that'll be true. This is basically saying he's not on the ground anymore, because the parameter I just called landed is not true, he's not on the ground. Collision event. As soon as the character collides with the collider, in this case I'm going to say the collider is the ground, so when the character hits the ground, then go to finished. I don't need to worry about storing it with force. So if I click on the ground right here, you see that there's a tag by each mesh. The tag right here, you won't see ground by default. You click on add tag and you can type in your tag here. If you just put it in here and I guess press the plus button and then it should add it. Plus might also create a new one. I don't need a new one, so I can just press minus. So as long as you type something in here, you should have a tag. You don't need to specifically name them, but I made one specifically for the ground just to make this easier on me. So this will say when he collides with anything called ground. So if you have this, you'd want to call this ground also, so he knows that he's landed on this. By default, these tags will be kind of blank, so anything you want to be the ground, just tag it as ground, and he'll know that he's landed on it. So once he hits the ground, we're going to go to set animator bool. Landed is now true. So now that he's collided with the ground, he is on the ground. This way it'll keep him floating before it goes back to idle. So that's the point of all this part. And then once he's been set to true, now he'll go back to idle. So that's the jumping state. At that point, once you've typed all that in there, he should be able to pop off the ground. In the meantime, he's still going to be in just a standing position, no animation. He's just going to be standing there, popping off the ground, walking or sliding around, and probably not attacking because there's no animation on there. Alright, so now we're going to put the animation on there. Alright, by default, you can create states by going to right-click, create state, and then create an empty. I can pop in an empty here, or I can delete it afterwards. Just right-click, delete. The idle state, you can rename these up here with the title. Idle is going to play my idle animation. Let's adjust our animations real quick. So going to clicking on each of these. So the hero animation attack, I made him a little larger, 10, because he kind of popped in a little microscopic on the scale. You might want to scale him larger in Maya when you build him the first time. But if you built him small, it's probably too late to adjust them without too much work. So you can just change your global scale right here. Rig, I just have set as generic. You could try setting it as like humanoid, but I just have it as generic. And then animations over here. So this is the one we're going to play with a little bit. All the settings up here should be fine. I'm going to call this, instead of like what it calls, I forget the default one, we're going to call this sword swing. And then it doesn't need a loop, it's just a one-time thing. So sword swing is going to play the whole thing. Make sure it's as long as you want it. From 1 to 22 is what I need. You can preview it here. And he's swinging. The mesh had some glitches, so it's not all appearing there. My issue on export, but it still works based on the other mesh. It should look correct here if you can, but those workarounds if it doesn't. I just have to pick the mesh that looks correct. Otherwise, if I pull this guy in here, you can see that he's kind of missing. So yeah, just pick the mesh that looks correct as your default guy if there's errors. Alright, so the next guy, a hero idle animation. So the same things apply. So scale, rigs, generic, animations. Idle is going to loop this time because it's going to keep playing over and over again, and you want it to play as long as your animation is. Make sure you name it idle. I'll skip jump for now. Let's go to walking. So that one's going to loop also, so we can keep playing in a loop. Make sure to name that walking as well. And so now the jump one's a little more tricky. With jump, I stuck them all inside the same animation, so instead of making them separate, so I have the jump up, the floating, and the landing. On the jump up, I have set from frame 1 to frame 8, so on start on frame 1, end on frame 8. If I jump over here to Maya on the jumping, you can see that on frame 1 he's standing still. By frame 8, I've completed the jump. By frame 10, he's floating in the air, and by 14, he's going to start landing on the ground. And it stops on frame 22. So these are my 3 different parts, all inside of one sequence. If I were to press play on this, you can see that he's going to start jump, he's going to hang in the air, and then he's going to land. The way I have this organized, let's say he's going to start nice and clean, he's going to duck down by 4, he's going to stretch by 6, and he's going to almost stay in the same position. The arm's moving, but that's not a big deal. Ideally, you want to kind of have him hold that lifting position so he holds it in the air a little bit longer. So I have about 2 frames. And then over the next 2 frames, he's going to pop into the floating state. So that should give him time to adjust. And then he's going to hold that for however long you want. I did 4 frames for that one, I guess. And then from this point forward, he's going to land back down and revert back. So frame 1 and 22 are exactly the same. Just copy and paste the 2 frames so nothing changes. And so everything works. You don't need him to physically leave the ground very high because the Unity code will push him up in the ground based on the velocity we typed in to set him at 5. This is just to look like he's moving. Alright, so based on these numbers, from 1 to 8 is going to be the ducking, from 8 to 14 is going to be the floating, and from 14 to 22 is the landing. So if I jump back to Unity, that's what these numbers are saying. So 8 to 14, and this is 14 to 22. So pick the numbers that match your animated events. Once all that's been set up, now we can go over here. So we click the idle and set the idle to your idle animation. So we just have to go and hunt that down wherever it is. Instead of calling it take 1, make sure you name things so they pop in easier. So idle, we'll go to create a state called walking, put the walking animation on there, and over here we do the transition. So you right click, make transition, and you drag it to where you want it to go. Escape on that. Alright, so once you have your transition set, you click on that transition line and you can start setting up what you want. This one has no exit time, so you want it to immediately go from walking to idle or vice versa. So it's not going to wait to finish the animation, it's going to immediately switch out. So no exit time. And what's going to cause the switch? We're going to set our conditions. So you click on add if you don't have one already, and then go to speed, or whichever you called them. So speed right here is going to say if speed is greater than 0.1, he must be moving, so go to walking. And then transition backwards, if speed is less than 0.1, he must not be moving, so revert back to idle. And so that's how all these work. Once you have between idle and walk and you press play, he should be able to walk around the ground and look like he's switching between the two. And again, both of these don't have exit time, they're just controlled by the conditions, which are the parameters set in the Playmaker code. Now, when he presses the sword to swing, we're going to go from the any state this time. Any state means at any point in the game, if you press the assigned button, it'll start the animation. So when you press the attack button, which I coded for enter, it'll go straight to the sword swing. So you create the event, say I want sword swing or whatever action you have, and what's going to cause that transition from any time or any state. This one again has no exit time because we're controlling it by a condition. The sword condition is the sword swing as we did in Playmaker. So when I clicked on, let's jump back to here, attack. So when you press the return button and the attack button sends you to here, the set animator trigger sword swing is this one. So now it's been turned on, it's been said you've triggered an event. Basically the trigger is here, the sword swing, play this animation, the button's been pressed. So to play the animation, this one on the transition does have exit time. Wait till the sword finishes swinging before reverting back to idle. So we don't need a condition to say what's going to happen. So the list is empty. It's just basically when the animation finishes, on exit time, go to idle. Alright, and lastly, if you go to any state and you say, or right click, add create state, jump. So in this one, it's going to start from the ducking downwards position. So what transition is going to occur? This one again has no exit time. The condition is the jump button has been pressed. Once the jump button's been pressed at any point, he'll play the jump, he'll play the duck at least, and then we'll transition into the floating state. The transition has exit time, it's just going to go right into it. It's going to go from the duck straight to the floating, and then it's going to hold the floating. So it's going to stay on this state until the transition has been met. So as you're floating, it's your floating animation. The transition requirement is that he has to be landed. So landed, which is your bool value, is true or false. Once he hits the ground contacting the ground tag, it says landed is true, so he lands on the ground. It then goes to the transition and says play the landing animation. He must have hit the ground because it's been told that it's true. Then this one has exit time because it's going to finish playing the landing, the hitting the ground animation, and then revert to idle. And that's how the animations kind of tie in there. So if I were to press play at this point, let's clear some screens off of here, move around, so you can see that it plays through your idle and your walking animations. You can also tell that your speed right here is changing. So if your speed's changing, then your code's been typed in correctly. If the numbers aren't changing, then they probably won't switch between the two. Next up we have the sword swing, so you press the enter button and it'll go from any state directly straight to your sword swing, play it, and when it finishes it'll revert back to idle. And the last one is jumping. When you press the jump button at any point, it goes straight to play the jump animation, which is a slight duck first, and then it holds that floating state while he's in the air until he hits the ground. Once he hits the ground, it says landing has been met, ground collision is true, go back to idle. And that should be everything you need to create a basic character. The last thing is if you want to add cloth dynamics, this is kind of a simplistic method. It's not the most cleanest, but it does attach a cloth physics to your character. The cloth physics is simply going over to clicking on the cloth that you want. In this case, you grab the whole character, click it again, you'll grab specifically the cloth that's attached to the character. And you go to add component, and I want to add a physics, and I want to add a cloth. So now there's cloth physics on the cloth. You want to add the scarf mesh to your physics, so click on this to find out where it is. So it's right here, and you want to add that to your skinned mesh renderer, which has, at the moment, mesh is none. So I'm going to take that mesh scarf, drop it on here, so now you have a mesh visibility, or you have mesh render, so it shows what collision mesh to show. Not collision, just mesh. So I can uncheck that, so I don't need that anymore. This one's just going to show a static image. This one's going to have the flowy, movie one based on the same polygons. Over here now we have our edit constraints. This will tell you where the constraints are going to occur at. So if I click on edit constraints, over here pops up this window. You'll see that you have a bunch of black vertices. You want to be in paint mode, unless you want to do select mode. In select mode, you can just kind of select which ones you want. Once they're selected, then you can go to paint mode and say, I want these to be green, and they should turn green. Otherwise, you can kind of brush mark and you get these green. I don't really want all those green, so I'm going to get rid of that green. So select, and yeah, it went back. Alright, so if I want to select just the upper ones, I can go to select. Under selection, max distance, I'm going to set that to 0.2, and since they're already selected, they turn green. So I can click off, and they've turned green. So pretty easy. Or I can just go to the paint method and manually paint them. Either way, green means it's going to be glued in place, and the black just means it's going to move around. So once that's done, I can turn off edit constraints. And the last thing I want to do is, if you want to add collision to the character so the cloth doesn't fly through your character, you just have to say what colliders the character is. So if I press 1 right here, it pops up the element which allows me to pick the Capsule Collider. I can go to here, pick it, and I have a hero Capsule Collider. So I click on that and it grabs the hero Capsule Collider. The reason that this is here is because on your character, if you added one, the Capsule Collider is separate from the character controller. So if you have cloth, then add this Capsule Collider, make it about the same size as your character, and check is trigger so it doesn't kind of make it jittery and bouncy around. So it's just a trigger at that point. It's no longer going to bounce on objects. Alright, so once that's been applied, he should be able to move around, and the cloth should blow around. You can try and change some settings also. I like to put the bending stiffness up to like 1 or something. This makes it a thicker cloth, so it's not just silky blowing all over the place. So it has a little bit of thickness and volume to it. And you can try to play with some other settings if you want. Otherwise, when you press play, he's still going to fall off the world because he doesn't have a collision on him. I could toss actually, yeah. If I take this guy and add a Capsule Collider, he shouldn't fall off the ground anymore. Capsule Collider should be a bit taller. 0.87 should work. 0.25. And these are the numbers I have based on the size of the character that I already have, so those numbers. So now he shouldn't fall off the world. So there's his cloth. Sometimes you get the cloth dangling a bit lower than it should be. I'm not sure why that occurs. You can just pull it up a little bit higher, and then when you press play, it should bounce back at the right height. So you get a cloth that kind of bounces around the character. Everything's attached. And if you don't have materials attached to your character yet, you might need to add some materials. By clicking on the character, you can kind of see where it says, actually they're all going to be on the mesh itself. So all these pieces of the mesh, you click on the mesh, all these have all that. If you brought it from Maya, you should have something called a material section or folder, and here's where I added the maps to the character. So if I have the textures right here, so if you don't have these materials carried in from Maya, then you just go to create and create a material. If I did that, I have a new material, and you can see here the albedo is your color, and the normal map, if you happen to have made a normal map, is your purple map. So I take on the color map, drag that onto, oops, click back on new material, take this, drag it onto there, and take the normal map and drag it onto there if you happen to have one. And now you've set up your material, so this is what he looks like. You then drag this new material onto your character and he'll have a material on him. So I don't need to drag it on there because I already have one. And that's how you set up the materials. And that should mostly about cover it. So you should have a character that walks around and performs everything that you've programmed him to do. And I guess the very last thing, once you have everything all set up, is to save the scene. So you go to, actually let me delete out that guy. Alright, so you go to File, Save Scene As, and call it whatever you want. I have it called Scene. You can call it Scene Demo. Just have something new, so now I have here. So it should be stuck down here, Scene Demo. Everything that we have here, remember, gets created in its own folder. So my folder is over here, the assets folder. So everything I have is in here. So make sure that this Unity folder, oops, there. So this entire Hero Unity folder, which has your assets in there, all gets carried away when you're taking it places. You need to keep this folder structure intact. For going for export, you go to File, Build Settings. We're going to do it for a PC build. You have to add the scene, so I can add the one that's currently open. So the scene demo is up here, and everything else should be set. So I'm going to press build. It'll ask where I want to save it at. Putting it inside the same root folder should be fine. Hero demo, save. If the green bar finishes, then it worked. If the green bar gets halfway or stops, then it doesn't finish. So it looks like it's getting close to finishing. Once this finishes, you'll have a standalone exe that you can take places. No one needs to have Unity at this point. You can send it to all your friends and you'll have your own playable, executable title. When you send it, make sure you have the data folder and the exe. These two are the ones you need. Without either or, the game won't run. So if you click on the exe, I usually do window to keep it in a window, play. And remember, whatever you set your camera to in game mode is what you're going to see over here. So I can walk around, swing my sword, jump onto things, and simply adding collision meshes to game objects will give you some objects to interact with. And that about covers it.